you differentiate like hyper or toxic masculinity versus real or healthy masculinity among Black men?
You know, part of what makes that question, really complicated is that we have to factor in media, because we
Mm,
live in a time frame where
yeah,
media
that's a fact.
shapes so much of our reality. I mean, it's pervasive. You know what I mean? And it's grown so quickly. I mean, I don't want to sound like the old man, but I do this in my class all the time. I remember the first cell phone call I was on. You know what I mean? I remember the first time I logged into the internet. I mean, these things
Mm,
now they're such a part of our reality. So when
yeah,
you talk about what kinds of images and ideas we're being given, I mean, it comes from so many directions. It's sometimes difficult to parse through the difference. But what I try and separate between toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity is that much of the time in popular media, what we're being told toxic masculinity is especially in the Black community, it's the actions of less than a fraction of a percent of Black men that
fact.
somehow get cast onto the majority.
Yeah.
And when you end up hearing discussions, especially for those of us who were raised in single mother homes, where you hear this kind of discussion of what Black men are capable of, what they did, and they'll quote movies, stories. A friend of a friend of a friend went through this. A great grandparent went through this, and this is what Black men are.
Mm.
And yet, if you actually ask them, much of the time, well, have you experienced this? You get all kinds of mental gymnastics. But
Right, 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 right.
but a lot of that is because we've taken these ideas in, men too, and boys, taking all these ideas in from popular media, and we forced them into our frame in terms of how we see men. So for me, toxic masculinity is really rooted in what media has portrayed about a very small percentage of Black men and put against the entire group. But when you actually look at the aggregate, if you step back and look at Black male behavior in terms of employment, in terms of roles in the family, time spent with children, if you look at it in terms of sacrifices made for loved ones, if you look at it in terms of political activity and activism, but not
Mm.
just the traditional activism you see on television where you got to be in the streets holding the signs, but who are the ones coaching? Who are the ones giving up time after work to go work with young boys? And those are the kind of dimensions that we have to look to for healthy dimensions of masculinity. And what you'll find more often than not is that there's more than enough to talk about. But as long as we base our conversation on what we've internalized from media, it's always going to be a warped conversation. This is why on my show, The Honest Report, one of the things I start with every week when I do a live, I have a segment where I call it Sacred Black Masculine. And that's
Hmm.
basically where we shout out whatever runs across my desk that week, but is something representative of Black male humanity. The kinds of
Yeah,
exploits that Black men engage in that are
yeah.
really common. But for some reason, because of how our media representation is kind of portrayed, kind of comes across as if it isn't.
Mm,
But it is actually quite
mm.
common. And so that's kind of one of the reasons that I do that. But it really is an uphill battle. I mean, I was one of those kids in the 80s. I was born in the 70s, raised in the 80s, and I came of age watching and reading. Like my mother had me read Color Purple like 3 or 4 times.
Ooh, interesting.
You know,
Very interesting.
and she took me to, all of those, well, I don't say all of them, but she took me to some choice Oprah Winfrey, Terry McMillan films kind of thing. And,
Interesting.
and that was her and her girlfriends. And I'd sit in on the war councils as a little kid, or I might be walking to and from the kitchen, listening to the discussions and, of course, all of that. But you heard these kind of narratives being internalized and represented as the sole expression of Black women's experiences with Black men. And there
Mm,
was always, moments of irony that was hard to get people to recognize. And so we can talk a little bit about that, as we go. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of that shapes how we even start the conversation on Black males.
so that makes so you're saying which I certainly agree that so much negativity or negative mindset that is associated with the Black men is largely shaped not only by this culture but perpetuated by media,
Oh, yeah.
and then the different ways that we can to continue to consume that as people.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. And
yeah.
that's one of the reasons so many men, have talked to me about difficulty communicating, because if they fall outside of the traditional narratives
Yep.
Black masculinity, they're virtually unseen. It's they talk about how difficult it is to actually be engaged unless they express certain tropes that are received in the larger culture, even amongst Black women, even amongst the Black community. So that said, there's definitely a set of scripts, if you will, that people are kind of trained to follow in order to be visible or in order to be worthy of identification in many respects. And if you fall outside of the narrative, you have a much harder time trying to kind of be seen. But we don't question the scripts enough and where they come from.
Yeah, no, I think yeah, that I think that is. I mean, you're spot on. I've talked to different friends about this, where myself, where I say, I think as African American women, I can say that I think we see that many of us are encouraged or taught how to even desire or look for the wrong things in a partner. And I was actually just talking about this with someone earlier today.
Mhm,
Actually, this was a white woman, and we were talking about this, and she was like, "Well, this does happen across all different cultures." But I told her, I think the key difference is like, whereas I have a Chinese friend, for example, where
mhm.
she can mess around in college, but she knows when she goes back home, if she brings home a certain kind of person, she's going to lose her inheritance. You
Ooh,
know what I mean? And there's like social consequences that certain people have
mhm.
for actually doing, or choosing the wrong thing. But it just seems like, well, in Black culture, like we as women, we kind of encourage or we go after this hyper toxic masculine kind of gentleman, especially in our younger years,
Mhm.
and there's no social consequences for doing so like there are in other cultures. And so now by the time we're 30 and 40, and the good guys that we never really gave a chance, they're now, some of them are married off to Becky or Marisol. Some of them are just like, forget it. I don't want to be with Black women because they didn't want me when I was building, and I think some of that is like, we're not, as women, we're not even trained how to appreciate the right things. We're looking at the athletes, we're looking at the entertainers, the rappers,
Those are
and
those
that's,
scripts. Yeah.
yeah, and we're overlooking the lawyers, the engineers, the teachers, the professors, the different men who were actually building and keeping society functioning. Like we overlook that as if it's just kind of lame. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I think that
It,
kind of feeds into it.
that's definitely something I've talked to many a man about, especially if you're not in one of those areas. If you're, like you said, if
Mhm.
you're a teacher or something along those lines where you don't fall into athlete, entertainer, so on and
Yeah,
so forth. There's almost a cognitive dissonance where people just kind of don't know how to look at you in certain respects, and women in particular, and how to frame your social value, right? But part of that, we have to actually begin to ask the question: how did this come about? Because it wasn't always the case. I mean, even during
mm,
my lifetime, it wasn't
fair.
like that. My grandmother never looked at my grandfather and said, does he make six figures? You know what I
Mm,
mean? She never looked at him and say and asked the question, well, how many degrees did he have? She didn't ask those kinds of questions. It was a very different era. So within my lifetime, we've seen this major shift. And
very.
one of the things I try to talk about is the way in which policy can shape behavior, especially on a macro level. And if the policies in place incentivize women to go it alone, because men can be replaced, one of the things you have is
Mm,
a culture that over time begins to shift in a manner where. And I was just talking to a subscriber to my channel yesterday,
mhm,
and she was telling me exactly what I was saying. She said, she came from three generations at least. She had grandmothers, mothers, aunties, cousins, and family friends, all women, who would advise her along the same route, in terms of what kind of man she should look for, what type of
mhm,
man she should bring home.
mhm,
And of course, if he upset her, what kind of things, what kind of legal means she could use to either punish him, you know what I mean, or get resources out of him. But the sole component to that was that, from the man she chose to the kinds of policies she could use on her behalf, much of it
interesting.
was centered around control, right? These policies put Black women in a position in the family where they are in primary control, and can actually serve in that. So you choose men who are not going to be a threat to that dynamic, right?
Mm,
You're able to
yeah,
identify those men, be with those men. Those men appear to be very, hyper masculine, as you pointed out earlier in your question. But at the end of the day, especially if they have a record, or especially if they're vulnerable, they're low,
yeah,
low employment, whatever the dynamic may be. If you're in a top position and you're choosing men that are in a questionable position, a lot of that comes about because the kind of culture we have is one where women are actually urging their daughters and granddaughters to serve in a position of control and of power. This is something I call the gynopotestal family structure in the
mm,
Black community, where you have spheres of women. How do I put this? So I met a woman on a dating app years ago.
Mhm.
She was in her, I'd say, in her 40s. We had a nice little conversation, and she started to tell me about her family structure. So her grandmother, who was the matriarch of the family, of course, ran her household, and she had several daughters, herself included. They ran their households, and then they had daughters, and they ran their households. And to the extent that there were some sons mixed in there, those sons were trained and socialized to serve in another woman's household in another family. So there was a sort of anticipation that he would be brought into another gynopotestal network. So here you have networks of women controlled houses and families that are using and referencing everything from welfare to family court to maintain positions of power within those families and choosing men that are vulnerable to those kinds of tactics. And after you do that for 2 or 3 generations, what do
Wow.
you have?
Wow, that's very interesting. I never thought of it that way, but I mean, I'm not the only black woman that is heard, like all the survival tactics, right? Get your education, make sure you can take care of yourself, make sure you do X, Y, Z, A, B, and C so that when he leaves you, right?
Right.
When he leaves you, you'll be able to take care of it. I mean, many of us have heard this from friends, older
Mhm.
friends, maybe aunties, cousins. Some
Yeah,
of us are mothers, some of us, close, whatever. But that that common narrative, like that expectation of when the dude that you choose decides to walk off,
yeah,
you're taken care of.
absolutely.
And not that I'm against, I certainly think it's okay and it's good for women to know how to, take care of themselves and be functioning adults. Like
Mhm.
that's just common sense. But it's like there's this fear-based narrative that we have that many of us have heard for years, and it's mind-boggling to be perfectly honest.
Well, I think when you talk about having an adult perspective that protects one's well-being, that's almost kind of a defensive thing where if this
Mm,
situation occurs, I know that these resources are here for me to defend. But I
right.
think part of what we're talking about has gone from defensive to offensive. I think it's become somewhat
Mhm.
predatory in some kind of forms of it where it, like you said earlier, when he leaves. See, that's an
Right.
offensive gesture. That's not, well, if the relationship doesn't go well, what can I do? That's when he leaves, I will do X, Y, and Z. And so that in and of itself, again, is part of a series of responses to the environment, right? Where you have people that are socialized to respond in very particular ways. And much of this in the Black community has really been framed in a very gender split manner. So,
Yes.
we can talk about, historically welfare, college access. We can talk about the current programs going on with the Ford Foundation, going on with Goldman Sachs, Google, Visa, MasterCard, and I can list a number of others, or even the policies and practices that came about in the last year during the pandemic to support Black women run entrepreneurial businesses. You never heard mention of Black male entrepreneurial businesses. So,
Yeah,
what does
you
that
don't.
do to a community when you only have, now there are programs, of course, for Black folk as in general, but I've
Mhm.
run into Black men that have had to go get sisters and cousins to be the female face of their business just to get support, right? So
That's
what does that
crazy.
do?
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, and I liken it to kinda like moving into an area and gentrifying the area, right? If you're gonna come in
Mm,
and buy up all the property and create a new buffer class, well, that's how you kinda do it. You come in, you identify the group you want to, exploit, but really do so by giving them opportunities, and then you have another group you ignore entirely. What does that do in a general sense? But then you fine tune that a bit. How does that affect actual relationships? If relationship after relationship after relationship, you see the same kind of dynamics of who has certain types of support and who's struggling. Well, over time, you're going to develop a perspective about that. You're going to
yeah,
develop
no,
an attitude
absolutely.
about each group.
Man, man, you just said a ton there. For those of you who are on, please get those likes up. Tag anybody on this discussion who you think may find it interesting or useful. We are talking about Black masculinity and whether or not Black women are taught to fear or honor Black masculinity. I also want to give a special shout out to Game Dreamer 58. Keep up the great work. And I want to give an especially big shout out to Miss Delta Guy for the $100 super chat. Again, much love and support. I appreciate all of it. And it looks like I got another one in. Special shout out to Raw for the $5 super chat. I see. Let the electricity go out in every black city for just a week. You have a black woman rumbling each other to find a husband. Life is just too easy now.
Now
Actually,
that,
it's facts.
you know,
That is
that's interesting. Yeah, I was talking about that. I think it was like a year and a half
oh
ago.
man.
We saw that kind of dynamic happening, where the economy was starting to dip, and this was around the time period where Trump was sending out food boxes. I don't know if you remember that a little while ago, and all of a sudden, brothers were writing into me on how they were getting these hey big head texts.
Hey.
Um, I'm going back from 20, women from 20 years ago. Like, are
That's
you
crazy.
single? What's going on? It was really like a big game of musical chairs. Can you grab somebody before all hell broke loose? It really gets to that point. So yeah, there's some reality to that. And of
It's
course, the
almost
pandemic revealed that too.
right. It's almost as if singleness is a luxury. Is
Oh,
is a modern luxury.
hmm oh yeah, very much so. And what it takes to be single and and this is something we hear a lot, especially in the manosphere. Where the question is, all right, do you have enough to retire on? What will that take?
Mm.
And I think Kevin Samuels is one of the ones that points that out the most. If you need X amount to retire on, do you have that as a single person? And I think a lot of people have a very fantastical view of how money works and how much they need and so on and so forth. It's we really have to get realistic about that.
Yeah, that's facts. That is total facts. Again, for those of you who are on, please get those likes up. Tag anybody on this discussion who you think may find it interesting. So on now to the next question.